I know without any doubt that all of you understood it here and in TV land. But since it is right at the heart, according to some reports, right at the heart of almost everything was, I just wanted to repeat a Kyroots from last time, or part of it, that so long as a caged animal believes that the bars are of his own making, escape always seems possible. That's for anyone, which is everyone, who still has some ponderings at times, muses, reflections on the so-called question of the relative effects between heredity and environment. Well, such as some myths that I have reported from other galaxies that say there is no such thing actually as environment, that your environment is simply everybody else's heredity, and so therefore it doesn't exist, and any reasonable mind can say, well, it does exist. That's just stupid. A caged animal, as long as it believes that the bars are, how about this, at least partially of its own making, then escape always seems to be within the realm of possibility. For anybody would think, well, why would life fool us in this way? I'm just repeating what I heard, folks. Simply a conduit for conduitness. To pull up the loose strings of mentioning about how the mind, not just in religion, but using that as the springboard several weeks ago, that the ordinary mind has got to have an external source of authority. For those of you that still want to choke on the idea of, wait a minute, there is an environment. There is some kind of genetic basis of us being humans. That's why I'm a male or female, or I'm green or red or tall or short. But by God, there are other things. Because I wasn't born this mad, this depressed. I wasn't born this dumb. I had to work at it. I wasn't born all beat up emotionally. It took my father and those 3 women he lived with to do it. The mind will not operate at the ordinary level. There is no such thing as the secondary world. You could forget all stories of guides coming down and giving the spark. Of course, I've always considered how fortunate it was that Michelangelo happened to be there at the moment to capture that. But at any rate, or else we'd have never known what God looked like. Which is surprising how much he looked like. Now I think about Michelangelo. I'm sure it's a coincidence. The ordinary mind, not that this is the full statement of it, but the ordinary mind would not be operational did it not have what appears to be some external source of authority, whether it adopts it, whether it pushes against it. And we were further noting last time that using religion, our scientific method, our common sense, that one of the great collective uses is, or institutional uses, is that in these external sources of authority, such as religious people saying, well, God's already said, thou shalt not overeat. Thou shalt not covet thy wife's woodpecker. Thy neighbor's wife. That was it. That whatever the matter is, or a man who thinks too much, grieves too much. That collectively, at the institutional level, at street level for ordinary thought, it operates on the basis that, well, if God, or the scientific method, common sense, or experience, which could be labeled the refuge of those who have no refuge, those who've even turned their back, God forbid, on continuity, but at least they have a final refuge, experience. I may be dumb and stupid and not know anything, but by God, I've got experience. Which we don't have time to stop and ponder, because I don't know what you do with that, but that's considered common sense out in the world, and who are we to say? But as long as the external authority, the great example being God, for instance, or our Holy Scripture, as long as the matter has already been addressed, I do not have to think about it. And if I did have any passing thoughts, they would have to be ignored, because if I had any passing thoughts that were in conflict with this, then it's got to be the work of evil external authority. But then when it gets down to the individual level, there is the matter that I believe it was Kyroots, or else it was you people, one or the other, brought up not too long ago, that there is a dual power inherent in all this that could be defined in a nice term, the dual power of, quote, gods and cliches. In the fact that all the gods, all the apparently supernatural external sources of authority, always say the expected and the comfortable. But then at the individual level, although that operates on a wide collective level, at the individual level, then you've got men in their minds doing the same thing. Which of course could just be the tip of the iceberg. Doesn't pay to be subtle, you people, does it? See, I was going to do a whole string of cliches. But Jesus, boy, am I already disheartened, because many of you are taking notes and writing that down and nodding seriously. What the hell we just say? Do you remember several weeks back we pointed out that the gods always, all revealed information, all great supernatural messages sent down to man are always not supernatural. Well, they're always a matter of cliches. They have to be. And no one notices it, which is not to tell you anything about gods. It's not to fall in that kind of old cheap trap of saying, well, it is surprising that all of men's gods strongly resemble the men who worship them. I mean, it takes a genius to ever say that, which I shouldn't say that, because some of the people who've said that are considered historically geniuses. That, wow, a guy once said that, a guy once figured that out. It's surprising that all the Chinese gods seem to have a certain Oriental tinge to them. And you go into an area where people are green, and God is curious. I assume you can fill in from there. Go to a land where everyone has 3 eyes, and I'll be damned. The gods that speak to them, that come down to give them the great information. I know you won't believe this, but the gods have 3 eyes. That is it. That is the cliche, which is a form of comfort. It is a form of continuity. And if there was something to be learned from the ordinary external so-called revealed information, Holy Scripture, then you should be able to see by now, without me continuing to beat on that same little drum, that there would be something exciting. There would be something new. And there's not. Well, it's good when it's dead, because they can say it is. They can say, well, and then one day Jesus or Abraham stood up and told the people, this is only the tip of the iceberg. And they had never heard this, and the people fell. They swooned. Some of them passed out. They tripped. They began to rent their hair and clothes and go, lo and verily. And they were amazed. But see, the past is just like a turbocharged cliche, in case you never noticed it, which is one reason the past is so popular. Because if it's in the past, if it says, well, God came down and spoke to Muhammad and said, go tell the people, I'm telling you first, the one thing everyone's been waiting to hear, and that is that everything is simply the tip of the iceberg. And so you could hear that and go, give me a break. Well, I've heard that all my life. That was a revealed knowledge. You're going to tell me that 1,400 years ago that a brand new God, or God in a new manifestation, came down in a cave and said to Muhammad, here's the secret. Everything's just the tip of the iceberg. And you could say, well, that's dumb. A kid knows that. You can read down the back of a cereal box. But the answer is, well, sure you can now, but then that was big news. That was a major breakthrough. And what are you going to do? You have to go, well, I guess so. How do I know? I wasn't there. But notice, since no one seems to enjoy this kind of challenge, notice, isn't it peculiarly coincidental? Except the ordinary mind can explain it. So it's not coincidental. If it happened in the past, no wonder I know it. But isn't it still curious? If you could turn time loose, if you could free it, as Kyroots pointed out last time, there's a strong possibility, he suggested, that it is birds that cause bird feed. We're not going to be dumb enough for me to ask anybody to follow all that. If you say that everything that the guides, all secret information, scientific information even, except it's just harder to talk about with general people, which I don't know why I'm worrying about that. Everything that seems to be revealed information from these great external sources always must be cliches. But then I tried to point out to you, that the defense can be, well, at the time they were said, which was 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, they were not cliches. But they were so powerful, they have become common knowledge and become cliches. And then I ask you, consider. That's always the answer. Don't you find that coincidental? And then if you're ordinary, you'd go, and an ordinary mind, of course, is reasonable and works sequentially. And an ordinary mind would say, I don't know what you're getting at, because it's not coincidental. The point is, if it was said back then no wonder it's a cliche now, because it was so powerful that people repeat it. And so you can't say, well, it was a cliche then. And then you can't ask me, I'm still talking for the ordinary person, then you can't ask me, well, isn't that coincidental? It's not coincidental, that's the only way it could have worked. Unless you can turn time loose. Huh? You turn some birds loose and you go outside in the morning and they've caused birdseed to be on the ground. No. You don't find it coincidental if that's the way it works. And if you don't find that coincidental, consider this. Have you ever thought anything, I don't mean anything when you were in some kind of drunken or mushroomic inspired deranged condition, but just being an ordinary person up here, have you ever thought anything that was not a cliche? Well, of course you could now really get fancy and say, well, yes, I have, and I know you have. But there have been guides somewhere in the past, you can still find reference to them somewhere under, look under the index and it'll say, historical curios regarding alleged guides. And you'll look, and a guide somewhere, in some little strange place, at some little strange time, it's reported that one guy staggered out of the forest or a cave and says, a new guide spoken to me, and he said, icebergs are an illusion. It's a footnote. It's not a cliche. It's insane. And so you can say, well, I have thought things before that were not comfortable. Now, one more time, I'm not talking about anything weird. I'm just talking about that you attempting to think about life. You have never thought anything that was not a cliche. You have never thought anything uncomfortable. Now, I know you have. But it ends up being the same thing as a footnote. That is, well, yes, I thought of it, and what did you do? Well, I immediately turned the page. To change metaphors in mid-suffering. That is, if you're trying to find out what have the guides had to say, what has religion, what has the great sources of external authority had to say about the nature of life. And so you go referring to books. And you find all the great things that the big-time guides have said, big-time religion. And so maybe somewhere in there, that whoever compiled the book, just periodically will throw in, oh, by the way, what Jehovah said to Abraham reminds me of the fact, this is the author's, reminds me of the fact that right outside of Orlando, Baghdad, it was reported there was a small cult of people, 2372 BC, that believed that a God said so-and-so. And assumed that there it was a very non-cliche, non-comfortable fact, or just a non-sequitur like he said icebergs are an illusion, or icebergs are an illusionary work of satanic forces. In other words, a non-cliche, something not comfortable, what do? If you're interested in the great historic religious truth to start with, you skip all that. I mean, it might be worth just a short notice, but that's not what you're into. If you're ordinary, then up here, uncomfortable, non-cliched thoughts are not what you're into. If you are then you're mucking about with the scheduled travel of this bus. And if you're ordinary, you got no business doing it, remember. Dr. Kyroots has already pointed out, as you should well know, that those who think you shouldn't fool around with your mind shouldn't. So you do not have to simply look and try to follow this as being some actual historical basis, which it is, but God forbid that I try to say that and even make it worse. The historical truths, the guides, using it in the widest sense of the word, have always spoken in cliches. That's the only way it's comfortable. That's the only way that keeps any continuity going. And what seems to be major breakthroughs, and I'm not going to actually apply to any religion, but if the forerunner, let's take the Western world, the forerunner before Judaism, let's say, that if the line was God is a rectangle, and then the next group comes along, there seems to be some kind of progression. And this could be scientific knowledge. Again, I'm just using the easiest one. It could be customs. It could be sexual mores. It's the whole march of progress. The progress next is going to be that God comes and reveals himself to a new prophet 200 or 300 years later, the next department down sometime. And what's going to be the major breakthrough? God is now a rectangle. What did I say the first? God is now a cube. That will be the breakthrough, because there simply has to be continuity, and it has nothing to do with religion or guides. It has to do with the operation of the human mind. And so it must be cliched. It must be comfortable. But rather than you finding anything amiss with life, is all you got to do is look here. And there's nothing you can directly do about it, because the alternative, you're falling into this, you say, well, you're right, all I do is think. My mind operates in the same old grooves and cliches. Then if you're ordinary, you try to do something about that, what are you going to do? Put on a funny face, begin to babble, which is, I must say, is not going to get you anywhere. It might get you somewhere, but nowhere very interesting. Nowhere that you would probably like to be unless you begin to take it seriously, and then you belong where they're going to put you, and you won't notice it anyway. But that is just trying to be weird. You know about all that accomplishes, if you're good, is you may become weird. That could be your lifetime achievement in the city. It is a, may I say it and get it over with, I was going to say it's a fine line trying to walk between actually being able to think with no particular reason now, not think about anything in particular, not just think about religion, as thinking about politics, but just being able to use the mind. I was going to say, and then retract it, but let's get it over with, that it is a fine, all right? We have some extra adjectives. An extremely fine line that one must walk, trying to think newly, think afresh, and yet, that is to get away from the cliches and that which is comfortable, and yet walk that, all right, extremely fine line between that and just being weird for the sake of weird. And that, may I suggest, that even makes sense. Except it's moot. Because if you can't do it, then somebody pointing that out is not going to help. The only thing that would help is somebody that would listen to it, that shouldn't be fooling with their mind anyway, and they already suspect it, and they hear it and go, that's true. I like some of the ideas of this kind of weird crap, but you got to watch your stuff. You got to be careful. I mean, you could fall off into a great abyss of insanity. And of course, kind of a humorous response to people like that is, well, it's not going to be such a long fall. You're not going to hurt. You're not going to hurt yourself. But of course, in their view, it is correct that if an ordinary person could do this and still be ordinary, boy, it'd give a whole new definition to insanity. They should dig up Freud and Jung and let them say, hey, we thought we'd seen nut people, but hey, this is a whole new ball game. Because they would. Which, I don't guess that's depressing, but it was, Kyroots already pointed out a few nights ago that only revolutionists seem to join the revolution, but that was almost too obscure for any of us. But for some reason it came to mind. There is, what I was going to say, now that we disposed of, that fine line. That yes, it would be nice to think differently. Of course, an ordinary person would want to do other things, behave differently, feel differently. There is no doubt I follow some of what you're talking about, and I'm not religious, and I don't give a damn about living up to anybody's expectations, but me personally, yes, that's me I'm pointing to. Me personally, I wish I was not so, fill 'em in, shy, aggressive, filled with self-pity, angry, envious of my fellow man, so obvious of my own shortcomings. Are you a woodpecker? I wish I was not like that, and so I would like to basically somewhere inside, or what is it they say in the study? Inside of my own self, which I've always liked. Sometime in your spare time would somebody explain that to me? Inside of my own self. People say, well, inside my own self I've always wanted to, and I always, not me, but this, I got a cousin, he always thinks, well, as opposed to inside of, well, I'd like to do so and so, but inside of that person, I would like for them to want to do it, and somebody will benefit. I don't know. Probably just a rhetorical problem there that. But this moot point that we disposed of, that yes, there would be a fine line between trying to, and I was just saying think, although ordinary people would want to phrase it as act differently, feel differently, which, you're always back here, you're always dealing with the secondary world, because if there were any necessary problems, there are problems that actually came from the primary world and could be isolated as being there. It's also what Kyroots was trying to point out tonight, that in that sense it is easier to cure cancer than it is depression. And easier was just the easiest word to use. And of course, an ordinary mind can say, well, that's foolish, but it's not. It's easier to cure death than it is depression. This fine line that an ordinary person would, without any doubt, say, yes, I would like to feel differently, I'd like to be differently, I'd like to think differently, and all that. And then they would say, though, the one we disposed of, but I can't seem to get rid of it, is that say, yes, but there's a fine line. If I was an ordinary person out responding back to this, it'd say, all right, what you're talking about is thinking about cliches, and they about the same thing over and over. Yeah, I know what you mean, I won't disagree to that, and I would like to be able, if I'm still an ordinary mind, if I'm going to listen to you and just take it, your phrase, think differently. All right, if I can think differently. But wait a minute, you can't just go around thinking differently. You can't go around saying, well, and point up the sun and say, oh, look at there, it's a McDonald's. You can't do that kind of stuff. You drive yourself nuts. Now, that would be thinking differently. Or start wearing my shoes on my head. My underwear, wrap it around my arm like some kind of signal. And when I first meet people, say, oh, goodbye. Yeah, I can do all that. I can do all that, but not only is that foolish, not only that cannot be what you're talking about, is it? And I'd have to agree that, no, it's probably not. I hate for people to ask a direct question like that. Probably not, sir. Then they'd say, well, but what else can you do? And I certainly, and I know I speak for the rest of you, we would not be so crass as to point out to them that that may be the problem. Which ordinary minds don't want to hear that. Wait a minute, because then they'd want to say, wait, you mean my question may be the problem? And then they'd probably be inclined, especially if they were from a northern section of the country, make some kind of rude gesture. Sometimes they say that's the way they call a cab in New York, but I know better. For those of you who haven't been around, don't let them fool you with that. Especially they say, well, it's an Italian cab I was calling. We have a special word. They're making light of you. But even if it had some validity, the part we kept trying to get rid of, that it doesn't, it's not a question of an ordinary person saying, well, you got to walk this fine line between trying to think in a new way and overdoing it. And that's always good for a laugh among a few people. Very few. Not those who ask such a question. And not those who might drive themselves crazy. It is not funny. You know that? Well, some of you know that. But, wherein it seems to be this line that you would have to exercise a certain amount of intellectual decorum, a little mental, create your own kind of mental safety net, a certain kind of internal health orientation that I cannot overdo this, which is true, but that's not what they mean when they say it, because they're correct. You can't overdo it, since you can't do it. But they think, well, we got to walk this fine line, trying to struggle against habit, which is all you're talking about, isn't it? All right, yes, it is. But you got to watch it. You're right. But now let's assume that that was not moot and that you're not an ordinary person. There is a danger. Past the point of where you can shake that loose and realize that's not my problem. I see what it is, and that's not the problem. I'm going to overdo it. Then the question is a certain kind of, we might say, danger that Kyroots also pointed out that I was trying to get back around to, of being able to take a potential land of opportunity and through great effort turn it into a graveyard. To take splendid beachfront property and through your own now would-be revolutionist activities turn it into a landfill. Which would only sound, or to some of you at first blush it'd sound, well, that's more apropos to talking to ordinary people. Yeah. I guess down to a matter that you might put it this way, all right, that being intellectually comfortable in the widest sense, that is personally comfortable, ordinary person would call it. Me as a person, me inside of myself. Being intellectually comfortable is, of course, comfortable. But if you have this certain turn of mind, any comfort is too much comfort. Can anybody here in anything like this, and we do it, you do it, Kyroots does it, because it has to do with the nature of being locked in this kind of closet, verbally at least. You can hear the basis, even when it's got nothing to do with religion, when it's got nothing to do with morality, which obviously none of this does, that you can hear also a background radiation. If you want to be good, another way, like the original model for people believing that there is sin, that there is something possible, condemnable in me. How dare me think that? And then it comes out in the crudest sorts, that people claim, sane, serious people in the city, that they are in deep, heavy-duty, turbocharged analysis at great expense to themselves because of the fact, I started to say simply because of the fact that when they were 12, they had never forgotten it, or at 8, that one day they turned around and looked at their mother and thought, I wish you were dead. How old are you, sir? 48. How much you figure you spent on analysis thus far? You'd have to figure out what my gross income's been for the last 40 years, and then, I don't know, maybe 20%. How's it going? The doctor, when he'll talk to me, says that he nods. As long as I pay, he nods assuringly. All right, it's not silly, but can you see that the whole thing about suffering in life, another Kyroots point out, if you're going to suffer secondarily, which if you want to look at, they're necessary, inescapable suffering, such as cancer, let's say. If you have cancer, then it was inescapable. Hurting yourself, turning your ankle, sticking your eye out. Or hurting your eye, I don't get yucky about it. You can call that necessary suffering, or primary suffering, death, being like the grand marshal of all primary suffering parades, if you want to look at it that way. But in the secondary suffering, Kyroots pointed out, in secondary suffering, There are two ways to go about it. You either got to stay at home or go somewhere else. There's no cure. And an ordinary person might even say, well, all right, I followed some of this. Take that man's name, because that's a lie. But an ordinary person could say, well, I followed some of that. And all this is some kind of smoke screen. You're just trying to cover up the idea of sin or misstepping, being immoral. Look at it the other way, if they could. Look at it backwards. Look at it the other way. That is a crude reflection of what I am pointing out. Not because I'm right, or that this is right. It's the nervous system is right. If it's alive, it's right. And if it's alive, what it's doing non-verbally is always saying, what the hell is going on? What time's the next bus run? But it doesn't talk, remember. But it has no problem. The only problem is, where do we go from here? And it does not talk about it. Then, if you could have everything being simultaneous, then the comfort is in continuity. The comfort is, in the crude way of putting it, in cliches. The comfort is in thinking, well, at one time I believed that life was nothing but damn low-fat yogurt. But through great effort, I now see that life may in fact be sour cream. And then what comes out, what appears to be the sin, that yes, at one time I thought, I wish my mother was dead. The sin, the misstep, from a more complex, abstract view, if you were a revolutionist, whatever that might be, the sin is I keep thinking the same damn thing. And it's not a sin, and there is no way to condemn it. That is the caged beast. And it always thinks there's a way out, as long as it thinks, well, wait a minute. Now, part of this is my fault. And if it's not directly my fault, it's my family's fault, which is part of me. And if there was any real open-ended game, if there's any sport to this, then all the revolutionists would want to run over to the sidelines, get out their pom-poms, and once you'd get humanity to get that close and say, wait a minute, it may not be all my fault directly, because, hell, I'm still young. So maybe everything that I feel, all my harshness and anger and etc., may not be all my fault. It's partly my family's fault. Then all the revolutionists would want to strike up the band, get out your tuba, or, God forbid, clarinet, get out your pom-poms, and run up to the stands and go, could you go a little further with that? It's always nice to end. On a note to where people think, Jesus Christ. The climax, the punchline to this was worse than the setup. Oh, okay. So that was the punchline for the night. Because wait a minute, the conclusion was worse than the inquiry. Or put it another way, I thought the fire was bad until they got here and the equipment they had and what they attempted to use to douse this. Jesus Christ, I'd have preferred to burn up. Now do you see?